The turquoise water of the Willow Creek community pool, usually a shimmering invitation to playful relief from the oppressive summer heat, had become a cerulean abyss. Mark saw it happen, a distorted, slow-motion horror reflected in the rippling surface. One moment, Buttercup Leo's 6-month-old golden retriever therapy puppy was tethered by his leash to Leo's poolside wheelchair, a fluffy golden patch of contentment in the shade of their umbrella. The next, a yelp, a frantic scrabbling sound, and then the splash. Too small, too final. Karen Miller, doyenne of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association and self-appointed guardian of its draconian rulebook, stood at the pool's edge, her hand still on the pool skimmer. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, her voice a carefully constructed blend of surprise and mild concern that didn't quite mask an underlying satisfaction. "The poor thing must have slipped trying to get a drink. I was just trying to guide him away from the edge, for hygiene." Leo's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. A choked, guttural scream ripped from his 10-year-old throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. His small hands, their movements often uncoordinated due to his cerebral palsy, flailed uselessly, his wide, terrified eyes fixed on the spot where his beloved Buttercup had vanished. Mark was moving before conscious thought, the cheerful chatter of other families, the distant laughter, all sucked into a roaring vacuum. He hit the water in a desperate dive, the coolness a shocking contrast to the furnace of adrenaline in his chest. He saw a shimmer of gold deeper down, swaying with the gentle current. He reached, Buttercup gathered the heartbreakingly limp small body into his arms. The fur was already heavy waterlogged. When he surfaced, gasping, clutching Buttercup, the scene had shifted. Silence, thick and horrified, had fallen. Sarah, his wife, was already there, her face a mask of disbelief, kneeling beside Leo, trying to absorb the torrent of his keening cries. Karen, however, had regained her composure, her expression hardening. "Honestly, Mark," she said, her voice regaining its usual clipped, authoritative tone, "some people simply shouldn't have animals if they can't control them. It's a terrible shame, of course, but the pool rules are very clear about animal proximity for sanitary reasons." The world swam back into sharp, painful focus for Mark. The casual, almost dismissive cruelty of her words, the implication that this was somehow their fault, was a physical blow. He laid Buttercup gently on a sun lounger, a bystander silently offering a towel. He looked at Karen, his eyes usually mild and approachable, now chips of ice. "Karen." His voice was dangerously low. "What exactly did you see? I told you," she said, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "The dog was too close to the edge. I went to shoo it back, it got agitated, slipped, and I tried to reach for it with the skimmer to guide it out, but it just went under. A dreadful accident." Mark knew with a sickening certainty that settled like lead in his gut that this was no accident. He was chief of the city animal protection police. He'd seen too much calculated cruelty in his career. But her story, however flimsy, was a shield. "This accident happened to my disabled son's therapy puppy," Mark said, his voice tight. "In front of him." Karen's expression flickered perhaps a shadow of unease, but it was quickly replaced by her customary self-righteousness. "Therapy animal or not, rules are rules. And frankly, the emotional outburst from your son is quite disruptive." The uniformed officers Mark had called arrived, their presence cutting through the stunned murmurs of the onlookers. He was now Chief Davidson, the professional, even as Mark the father felt his heart shattering. He began the process requesting statements. Karen reiterated her accident story, emphasizing her attempts to help. Other witnesses, when approached, were hesitant. A few mumbled agreement with Karen's version, others claimed they hadn't seen it clearly. He could feel their fear. Karen Miller wielded her HOA power like a cudgel, and her vindictiveness was legendary. The days that followed were a blur of grief and a frustrating uphill investigation. Leo was a ghost of his former self. The vibrant spark that Buttercup had ignited in him was extinguished. He refused to eat, retreated into a shell of silent misery, his nights punctuated by terrible, sobbing nightmares. The empty space where Buttercup's bed had been was a constant, aching void. Sarah, her own grief, a heavy cloak, poured all her energy into trying to reach their son. But he was drifting further away, lost in a sea of trauma. Mark, meanwhile, battled the official narrative. Karen's story was neat, plausible enough for those who didn't know her, and difficult to disprove without direct contradictory testimony. The initial necropsy on Buttercup confirmed drowning, but could not definitively rule out an accidental slip versus being forcibly held under, not without more evidence. His colleagues were supportive, but the case was weak without witnesses willing to directly challenge Karen. Then Karen's counteroffensive began. It started subtly whispers circulating through Willow Creek. "Did you hear about the Davidsons' dog? So aggressive, apparently. That poor Leo, no wonder he's like that, his parents are so lax. Karen Miller was a hero trying to save it." The narrative shifted, painting Buttercup as a menace, and Karen as a brave, if unfortunate, intervener. She even had the audacity to send a sympathy card to the Davidsons, a saccharine missive expressing her deepest sorrow at the tragic accident, and hoping Leo would soon recover from witnessing such an unfortunate event. The HOA, with Karen's allies still firmly entrenched, began to subtly turn the screws. A notice appeared on the community bulletin board reminding residents about pet leash laws and hygiene standards around common areas, with an unsubtle nod to recent unfortunate incidents. Then came a direct violation notice for the Davidsons. Leo's specialized therapy bicycle, which he used on quiet cul-de-sacs under Sarah's constant supervision, was suddenly deemed a non-standard vehicular nuisance, according to an obscure bylaw Karen had unearthed. Fines were threatened. "She's trying to break us," Sarah whispered one night, her voice raw with despair as she held another of Karen's passive-aggressive HOA missives. "She's punishing us because you're investigating her. She's trying to make Leo the problem." Mark felt a cold rage, but he knew he had to maintain professional composure. Any outburst would play right into Karen's hands, validating her narrative of him being an overwrought parent abusing his position. He meticulously documented every instance of harassment, every whispered rumor he could trace, adding it to a growing, albeit circumstantial, file. The turning point, or so it seemed, arrived in a plain manila envelope slipped under their front door late one evening. Inside was a sheaf of photocopied documents, slightly blurred but legible. They were court filings from a different county dated 7 years prior. A civil lawsuit, Henderson et al. V. Karen Miller. The allegation, animal cruelty. The plaintiff's former neighbors of Karen, in a previous residential community, accused her of deliberately poisoning their cat after it had supposedly dug up her prize-winning roses. The case had been settled out of court, the terms sealed with a non-disclosure agreement. A jolt went through Mark. This wasn't just a one-off, rule-obsessed woman who'd panicked or made a callous mistake. This was a pattern. The document itself, due to the settlement and NDA, was probably inadmissible in a criminal trial for Buttercup and too old to reopen as a separate cruelty case without new direct evidence. But it could be critical in establishing Karen's modus operandi, her propensity for cruelty, when her perceived order was disrupted, and it could shatter her tragic accident defense. He immediately tried to trace the Hendersons from the old lawsuit. It took several days of determined digging, but he found a phone number for an elderly Arthur Henderson. When Mark finally reached him, the man was hesitant, his voice frail and fearful. "Mrs. Miller, she made our lives a misery after that. We signed papers. We can't talk about it. She said she'd sue us into oblivion if we ever spoke of it again. Mark's heart sank. Karen knew about this. She had effectively silenced them. He explained he was an animal protection officer investigating a recent separate incident. Mr. Henderson listened, and then with a sigh that seemed to carry years of pent-up fear, he said, "She called me last week after your dog. Someone must have told her you were asking around. She reminded me about the agreement. She said she knew people, that things could get very difficult for my grandchildren if old settled matters were disturbed." This was it. Karen wasn't just covering her tracks. She was actively obstructing justice, intimidating a witness in a potential pattern of behavior case. This escalated things significantly. The original documents might be tainted, but the act of threatening Mr. Henderson now was fresh. His boss, Chief Reynolds, a gruff but fair man, listened intently as Mark laid out the new information. It's still thin for a criminal charge on the old case. Mark and Henderson is clearly terrified. But her trying to suppress this now, that stinks. It shows consciousness of guilt for something. Keep digging, and be careful. This woman sounds like a viper. The pressure was immense. Mark was grieving, trying to support his broken family, fighting a smear campaign, and now navigating a complex legal web where his primary evidence of a pattern was being actively suppressed by the perpetrator. Leo had now retreated almost entirely, refusing to leave his room, the curtains drawn against a world that had shown him such casual brutality. The light in his son's eyes was dimming, and Mark felt a desperate race against time, not just for justice for Buttercup, but for Leo's very spirit. Karen, meanwhile, emboldened by the initial success of her accident narrative and the fear she instilled, demanded an emergency HOA meeting. The stated purpose: to address the recent unfortunate incident at the pool, clarify community standards, and refute certain malicious rumors and unprofessional conduct that have caused distress within our peaceful community. It was a blatant power play, designed to publicly shame Mark, discredit his investigation, and solidify her control. The community hall was packed, an oppressive humidity mirroring the tension in the room. Karen Miller sat at the head table with the other 4 HOA board members, a portrait of calm, concerned leadership in a tasteful cream suit. Her lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Silas Croft, sat beside her, a stack of papers neatly arranged before him. Mark and Sarah sat in the front row, a small defiant island in a sea of anxious faces. Leo was at home with a trusted therapist who'd become a vital part of their lives. Subjecting him to this public spectacle was unthinkable. Arthur Jenkins, the nervous HOA president, tapped the microphone. "This emergency meeting," he began, his voice quavering, "is called at the request of board member Karen Miller to address recent events and allegations." Karen leaned forward, her voice smooth, almost sympathetic. "Thank you, Arthur, and thank you all for coming. I know there's been much speculation and frankly hurtful gossip surrounding the tragic accident with the Davidsons' puppy. It was a terrible, unforeseen event. I was simply trying to ensure the pool area remained safe and hygienic for everyone, as per our community bylaws. The animal sadly became agitated and slipped. My attempts to guide it to safety were tragically unsuccessful." She cast a pitying glance at Mark. It's understandable that in times of grief, emotions run high. However, it is deeply concerning when personal sorrow leads to professional overreach and the spreading of baseless accusations. Her lawyer then took the floor, his voice a silken blade extolling Karen's years of dedicated, selfless service to Willow Creek, her unwavering commitment to maintaining the high standards that protect our property values and quality of life. He painted Mark as a man consumed by grief, abusing his authority as chief of Animal Protection Police to pursue a personal vendetta against a blameless community servant. A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed sympathy for Karen's carefully crafted narrative. Mark felt Sarah's hand tighten on his. When it was his turn, Mark rose, his stance firm, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the charged atmosphere. There was no accident, he stated, his gaze fixed on Karen. Several witnesses saw Mrs. Miller unclip Buttercup's leash from my son's wheelchair. They saw her grab him. They saw her use the pool skimmer not to guide but to submerge a 6-month-old puppy. She did this in full view of my disabled son, Leo, for whom Buttercup was not just a pet, but a vital therapy animal. Karen gasped, a theatrical hand to her chest. That is a monstrous lie, slander. Is it? Mark continued, his voice resonating with cold anger. Or is it perhaps a pattern of behavior? Some of you may not know that Mrs. Miller was the subject of a civil lawsuit for animal cruelty in her previous community, for allegedly poisoning her neighbor's cat. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Karen's face, moments before a mask of composure, went white, then mottled with fury. That is outrageous. That matter was settled. It was a misunderstanding completely unrelated. A misunderstanding you are so desperate to keep quiet that you recently contacted the plaintiff, Mr. Arthur Henderson, an elderly man, and threatened him and his family to ensure his continued silence. Mark's voice was like steel. Is that also a misunderstanding, Karen? Or is it witness intimidation, obstruction of justice? Karen's lawyer leaped to his feet. Objection. This is not a courtroom. These are unsubstantiated inflammatory accusations. Indeed, Karen spat, recovering slightly, her eyes blazing. And speaking of unprofessional conduct and intimidation, Mr. Jenkins, I believe it's time the community saw the real Mark Davidson. She nodded to her lawyer, who dramatically produced a small USB drive. We have evidence of Chief Davidson's attempts to harass and intimidate me, a grieving innocent woman. The lights dimmed slightly, and a projector flickered to life, displaying a grainy video on a screen. It showed Mark, his face tight with anger, standing on Karen's doorstep. The audio was choppy, but his voice could be heard raised. You won't get away with this, Karen. I'll see you pay. The video ended abruptly. A shocked silence fell. Karen looked triumphant, a small venomous smile playing on her lips. As you can see, she said smoothly, a clear threat. This is the man leading a vendetta against me. Mark felt a wave of despair. The video was real from a day he'd confronted her after learning about the threat to Mr. Henderson, his control admittedly slipping. But it was selectively edited, stripped of context of her goading. Then a timid voice from the middle of the room. That video isn't right. All heads turned. It was Mrs. Gable, a quiet woman who lived down the street from Karen, known for her prize-winning roses and for generally keeping to herself. She was pale but resolute. I was gardening. I saw Mr. Davidson at Mrs. Miller's door, but I also saw Mrs. Miller later that day with her nephew, the one who's good with computers. They were on her porch with a laptop. I heard her say, "Cut that part out. Yes, there where I provoked him. Make him look unhinged." The hall erupted. Shouts of "What ought to know" echoed. Karen's face contorted. She's lying. She's always been jealous of my roses. But Mrs. Gable stood her ground. I have no reason to lie, Karen, but you do. Suddenly, the dam broke. Old Mrs. Henderson, no relation to the Arthur Henderson from the lawsuit, but a long-time Willow Creek resident, stood up, her voice trembling but clear. She threatened to report my cat to animal control for trespassing when he sat on her lawn. My Mittens is 16 years old and barely moves. Another voice. She fined me $200 because my children's laughter in our own backyard was exceeding acceptable decibel levels after 7 p.m. She had my son's basketball hoop removed from our driveway because it was aesthetically displeasing, One by one, residents rose their fear, seemingly evaporated in a collective wave of indignation. Stories poured out. Years of petty tyranny, vindictive enforcement of obscure bylaws, public humiliations, threats. The carefully constructed facade of Karen Miller, benevolent community leader, crumbled into dust, revealing the manipulative bully beneath. Her lawyer was frantically trying to intervene, but he was drowned out by the chorus of aggrieved voices. Karen Miller looked around at the sea of furious, accusing faces. Her composure shattered. Her eyes darted wildly, seeking an ally, finding none. With a strangled cry, she grabbed her purse and fled the hall, her lawyer trailing helplessly behind her, muttering about lawsuits and defamation. The silence she left was profound, then broken by a smattering of applause, which quickly swelled into a sustained ovation. Not for Mark, but for Mrs. Gable, for the Hendersons, for everyone who had finally found their voice. The climax hadn't been a single decisive blow from Mark, but the overwhelming power of a community reclaiming its truth. In the aftermath of the explosive HOA meeting, Karen Miller's world unraveled with astonishing speed. The board, minus Karen, convened an emergency session, and faced with the undeniable sentiment of the community and the gravity of the accusations, voted to suspend her from all duties pending the outcome of Mark's investigation, which now had fresh impetus and a flood of new witnesses. Mrs. Gable provided a sworn affidavit about the video editing, and other residents came forward to give official statements about Karen's past actions and threats. The district attorney's office, initially hesitant due to the he said, she said nature of the pool incident, now saw a clear pattern of manipulative and intimidating behavior. While the old lawsuit against Karen was still problematic, as direct evidence for Buttercup's drowning her attempt to silence Arthur Henderson and her fabrication of the video evidence against Mark were taken very seriously as indicators of consciousness of guilt and attempts to obstruct justice. Karen's high-powered lawyer, Silas Croft, fought tooth and nail. He filed motions to dismiss, argued that the HOA meeting was a public lynching and that Mark Davidson had orchestrated a witch hunt. He tried to discredit Mrs. Gable, suggesting she was a senile old woman with a grudge. But the sheer volume of credible testimony from diverse community members, combined with the forensic evidence from Buttercup's necropsy, which, while not definitive on its own, now fit a larger picture of deliberate action, and the chilling account from Arthur Henderson about Karen's threats, began to build an undeniable case. The critical piece came when a digital forensics expert analyzing Karen's laptop seized under warrant found remnants of the original unedited video footage from her security camera, along with software logs indicating recent extensive editing. The unedited footage clearly showed Karen goading Mark, making disparaging remarks about Leo, and then smiling coolly as he reacted with anger. It was damning. The trial was a local sensation. Karen Miller, once the queen of Willow Creek, sat pale and diminished in the defendant's chair. Witness after witness recounted her calculated cruelty at the pool, her years of bullying, her attempts to silence and manipulate. Arthur Henderson, though frail, testified powerfully about the original cat incident and Karen's recent threats. Mrs. Gable calmly detailed the video editing she'd witnessed. Leo, through a carefully conducted child forensic interview, played for the court, described in heartbreaking detail, watching Karen drown his best friend, his words painting a vivid picture of a deliberate, unprovoked act. His therapist testified to the profound psychological trauma Leo had suffered. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty. Felony animal cruelty. Guilty. Witness intimidation. Guilty. Falsifying evidence. Karen Miller, who had maintained a veneer of wronged indignation throughout, finally broke. A hollow sob escaped her as the verdicts were read. The judge, citing her egregious abuse of power, her calculated cruelty, the profound harm inflicted on a disabled child, and her complete lack of remorse sentenced her to a significant prison term, followed by lengthy probation. She was also banned for life from owning animals or serving on any community governance board, and ordered to pay substantial restitution to the Davidsons for Buttercup Leo's therapy and punitive damages. The healing for the Davidson family was a slow, arduous journey. Leo remained withdrawn for many months. The conviction brought a sense of justice, but not an end to his pain. Sarah and Mark poured their love and patience into him, supported by therapists and a community that now rallied around them with genuine warmth and contrition for their previous silence. Slowly, painstakingly, Leo began to re-engage with the world. He started drawing again, pictures of Buttercup with angel wings playing in a sunlit meadow. Several months after Karen's imprisonment, her house long sold, Mrs. Gable approached the Davidsons. With her was a trembling, fluffy golden retriever puppy, its paws too big for its body, its eyes wide and questioning. "A friend's dog had an unexpected litter," she said softly, holding out the puppy. "No one can replace Buttercup. But perhaps Leo might find a new friend to share his sunshine with." Leo, who had been listlessly watching from his wheelchair on the porch, looked at the puppy. A flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps a distant echo of joy, crossed his face. He slowly reached out a hand. The puppy, as if sensing the fragile hope, took a hesitant step forward and licked his fingers. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched Leo's lips. It was the first true smile they'd seen in over a year. They named him Ray for the ray of hope he represented. He wasn't Buttercup, and no one expected him to be. But he was a new beginning, a warm, furry presence that slowly began to fill the desolate spaces in Leo's heart. The Willow Creek Community Pool reopened the following summer, a different place. Near the entrance, a small, tasteful bronze plaque had been installed. It read, "In loving memory of Buttercup. May we always choose kindness." It was a quiet testament to a beloved puppy, a traumatized child, and a community that had, through pain and confrontation, finally learned the true meaning of standing together against cruelty and the enduring power of compassion. The sun, no longer a malevolent eye, cast its gentle, warming light on the water, reflecting a future that for Leo and his family finally held the promise of brighter days.